Deep in the Colorado mountains, two brothers stumbled upon something they never expected to find. Marcus and James had been hiking these trails for years, but this time, tucked behind a grove of towering pines, they discovered an abandoned cabin that seemed frozen in time. The roof had partially collapsed, the windows were shattered, and weeds had claimed the front porch. But somehow, the bones of the place still held promise. Their mother, Sarah, was dying. The doctors had given her months, maybe weeks. She'd always spoken of wanting to spend her final days somewhere peaceful, somewhere that felt like home. As the brothers stood in that forgotten clearing, an idea began to form. They would restore this place, board by board, nail by nail. They would give their mother the gift of serenity, but what secret would this cabin reveal when Sarah finally arrived? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Thompson had sawdust in his veins and calluses that told the story of 30 years building custom homes across Denver. At 42, he understood wood grain the way other men understood stock reports. His hands, broad and scarred from countless projects, moved with the confidence of someone who had never met a structural problem he couldn't solve. When he worked, the world made sense. Measure twice, cut once. Foundation first, details later. Simple principles that had guided him through the complexity of raising two teenagers after his wife left, through the grief of losing his father, and now through the unbearable reality of watching his mother fade away. James, 4 years younger and built more like their father had been, carried blueprints in his mind the way Marcus carried tools in his truck. As an architect, he saw possibilities where others saw problems. Where Marcus worked with his hands, James worked with vision. Their father used to joke that God had split one perfect builder into two sons, giving one the hands and the other the eyes. The old man hadn't been far wrong. Together, the brothers could envision and create almost anything, every Saturday for the past 3 years. Since their father's sudden heart attack, they had maintained their hiking tradition in the Colorado Rockies. The mountains had become their church, their therapy session, their place to process the weight of being the only children of parents who had given them everything. These weekly climbs through pine-scented trails had carried them through their father's funeral, through Marcus's divorce, through James's struggle to establish his architectural firm, and now through the devastating diagnosis that had shattered their carefully rebuilt world. Sarah Thompson had always been the anchor of their family. At 68, she possessed the kind of gentle strength that had held them together when their father worked long hours at the mill, when money was tight, when the boys tested every boundary she set. She had taught Sunday school for 30 years, volunteered at the food bank, and somehow managed to attend every baseball game, every school play, every graduation, without ever making anyone feel guilty for the sacrifices she made. When the doctors delivered the news about the aggressive lung cancer that had already spread beyond surgical intervention, she had listened with the same calm grace she brought to everything else. No tears, no anger, just a quiet nod and questions about practical matters. How long? What could they expect? How could she best prepare her sons for what was coming? The medical chart that Dr. Reynolds had shown them 3 weeks ago painted a picture in stark black and white numbers. Stage 4 adenocarcinoma, metastasized to the liver and bones. 6 months, maybe 8 with aggressive treatment, maybe less without it. Sarah had chosen a middle path, accepting some treatment to buy time, but refusing the harshest protocols that would steal her remaining months and leave her too sick to enjoy them. She wanted to spend her last Christmas conscious and present. She wanted to see the aspens turn gold one more time. She wanted to finish the quilt she was making for James's future children, even though he showed no signs of settling down. The brothers had responded to the news in their characteristic ways. Marcus threw himself into practical matters, researching treatment options, interviewing oncologists, creating spreadsheets of symptoms and medications. James retreated into quiet contemplation, spending long hours driving mountain roads and sketching houses he would never build. Both were drowning in their own ways, neither quite sure how to navigate the approaching loss of the woman who had taught them how to love, how to work, how to be decent men in an often indecent world. Their father's death had been a shock, sudden and final, leaving no time for preparation or goodbyes. The slow fade felt crueler somehow. Sarah grew a little thinner each week, tired a little easier, needed a little more help with tasks she had always managed alone. She never complained, never asked for pity, but they could see the effort it took for her to maintain a cheerful facade. In quiet moments, when she thought they weren't watching, her face would reveal the bone-deep weariness that no amount of rest could cure. The cabin discovery had come at the perfect moment, though neither brother could have planned it. They had been hiking the Maroon Creek Trail, one of their father's favorites, when James had spotted something unusual through the trees. A flash of weathered wood, a geometric line that didn't belong in nature's organic patterns. They had bushwhacked through the underbrush to find the forgotten structure, its heavy oak door still hanging on iron hinges that bore the patina of decades. Someone had carved initials into the door's weathered surface, though time had worn them nearly smooth. Standing in that small clearing, surrounded by the towering silence of the mountains, both brothers had felt the same inspiration strike simultaneously. This place, hidden and peaceful, felt like an answer to a prayer they hadn't known how to voice. The drive back to Sarah's house felt different that evening. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, while James stared out at the familiar streets of their childhood neighborhood. They had agreed to tell their mother about the cabin, but neither quite knew how to begin the conversation. How do you explain to a dying woman that you want to restore an abandoned building in the mountains? How do you ask someone with limited energy to invest hope in such an enormous undertaking? Sarah was sitting in her favorite armchair when they arrived, a photo album spread across her lap. She looked up with the warm smile that had greeted them countless times over the years, though they could see the effort it took now. The album's pages were yellowed with age, filled with pictures neither brother remembered seeing before. Mountain landscapes, hiking trails, scenic overlooks that seemed somehow familiar yet foreign. "Mom, we found something today," Marcus began, settling onto the couch across from her. "An old cabin up on Maroon Creek Trail. It's been abandoned for years, but the bones are solid." Sarah's hand stilled on the photo album. Something shifted in her expression, a flicker of recognition that she quickly masked. "A cabin?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. James leaned forward. "It needs work, a lot of work, but Marcus thinks the foundation is sound, and I can see the potential in the design. It's beautiful up there, Mom. Peaceful, the kind of place where someone could just breathe." "We were thinking," Marcus continued, watching his mother's face carefully, "maybe we could fix it up. Create a retreat where you could spend some time. Away from the city, away from the hospital smells and the noise. Somewhere quiet." Sarah closed the photo album abruptly, her fingers trembling slightly as she set it aside. For a long moment she didn't speak. When she finally looked up, her eyes held a depth of emotion that surprised both her sons. "Tell me about this cabin," she said softly. "Describe it to me." James and Marcus exchanged glances. They had expected practical objections, concerns about the expense and effort involved. Instead, their mother seemed almost hungry for details. James described the setting, the grove of pines, the small clearing with its view of the distant peaks. Marcus talked about the structure itself, the solid log construction, the stone foundation that had weathered decades without shifting. "The door?" Sarah asked suddenly. "What did the door look like?" The specificity of the question caught them off guard. "Heavy oak," Marcus replied slowly. "Old iron hinges. Someone had carved initials into it, though they're pretty worn now." Sarah's breath caught almost imperceptibly. She reached for the photo album again, then seemed to change her mind. "This cabin," she said, her voice thick with an emotion they couldn't identify. "How far is it from the main trail?" "Maybe a quarter-mile through the trees," James answered. "Why, Mom, do you know something about it?" For a moment, Sarah looked as if she might speak, might share whatever memory had stirred behind her eyes. Instead, she straightened in her chair with a resolve they recognized from their childhood. "You boys are going to restore that cabin," she said firmly. "Not for me, but because it's the right thing to do. Some places shouldn't be left to decay." "Mom, it's a huge project," Marcus protested. 6 weeks of hard work, maybe more, and you don't even know if you'll have the strength to enjoy it when we're finished." "I'll have the strength," Sarah replied, with quiet certainty. "That cabin needs to come home, and so do I. Don't ask me to explain that right now, but trust me when I say this is important. More important than you realize." James studied his mother's face, noting the way her jaw had set in the stubborn line he remembered from his teenage years. When Sarah Thompson made up her mind about something, earthquakes couldn't shake her resolve. "All right," he said finally. "We'll do it, but we'll need to work fast." 6 weeks, Marcus agreed reluctantly. "That gives us time before the first snow, and before—" He didn't finish the sentence, but they all understood. Sarah reached across and took both her son's hands in hers. "Oh, thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means to me. That cabin has been waiting a long time for someone to care about it again." After they left, Sarah sat alone in the gathering dusk, the photo album once again open on her lap. Her fingers traced the edges of pictures taken 40 years ago, when she was young and the world seemed full of endless possibilities. Tomorrow, she would have to decide how much to tell them. Tonight, she would simply let herself remember. The morning air carried the crisp promise of autumn when Marcus and James returned to the cabin 3 days later. They had spent the intervening time gathering tools, making lists, and trying to wrap their minds around the scope of what they had committed to accomplish. Marcus's pickup truck groaned under the weight of chainsaws, sledgehammers, crowbars, and every measuring device he owned. James carried surveying equipment and a digital camera to document the cabin's current condition. The structure looked even more daunting in the clear morning light. What had seemed charmingly rustic during their first visit now revealed itself as a catalogue of serious problems. The roof sagged ominously over the main room. Several logs in the eastern wall had rotted through completely, and the front porch looked ready to collapse under its own weight. Weeds had grown up through gaps in the floorboards and somewhere in the walls. They could hear the scurrying of small creatures that had made the abandoned building their home. "Jesus," Marcus muttered, running his hand along a beam that crumbled at his touch. "This is worse than I remembered." James was already sketching, his architect's eye cataloguing structural issues and potential solutions. "The foundation is solid," he said, more to convince himself than his brother. "That's what matters. Everything else can be rebuilt." They spent the first hour simply clearing debris from the main room, hauling out decades of accumulated leaves, animal nests, and chunks of fallen ceiling. It was back-breaking work that left them both filthy and questioning their sanity. Then Marcus's crowbar struck something metallic buried beneath a pile of rotted floorboards. "Hold up," he called to James, who was wrestling with a section of collapsed shelving. "There's something here." The metal object turned out to be a rectangular box, about the size of a shoebox, with a tight-fitting lid that had protected its contents from moisture and time. Marcus worked it free from the debris and carried it outside, where the light was better. The box bore no markings, just the patina of age, and the slight denting that spoke of careful handling over many years. James joined him in the clearing as Marcus carefully pried open the lid. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oiled cloth, lay a set of hand-drawn architectural plans. The paper was yellowed, but perfectly preserved, covered in precise pencil lines and careful measurements. Someone had drawn these plans with painstaking attention to detail, noting every beam placement, every joint, every dimension of the cabin they were standing in. "This isn't some mountain hermit's shack," James breathed, studying the drawings. "Look at these specifications. Whoever designed this knew what they were doing." The plans revealed a level of sophistication that wasn't apparent from the cabin's current dilapidated state. The original design called for hand-fitted log joints, a stone foundation with proper drainage, and a roof system engineered to handle heavy snow loads. There were detailed drawings for custom windows, built-in furniture, and even a stone fireplace with precise dimensions for optimal heat distribution. The person who built this was a craftsman, Marcus said, his respect for the unknown builder growing with each detail he studied. These joints, this roofing system, this was built to last generations. James pointed to a notation in the corner of the main plan. Look at this. For E and the children, may this always be home. Signed H.T. and dated 1962. E and the children, Marcus repeated thoughtfully. A family lived here. This wasn't just a hunting cabin or a summer retreat. Someone raised kids in this place. They spread the plans on a flat section of the porch and compared them to the current structure. Despite decades of neglect, the bones of the building still followed the original design faithfully. The collapsed areas could be rebuilt to the exact specifications, and the foundation showed no signs of settlement or failure. "We need to talk to someone local," James said. "Find out who built this place, who lived here. Maybe there are people in town who remember the family." Their first stop was Morrison's Hardware, a weathered building on the main street of Cedar Falls that looked like it had been serving the mountain community since the 1940s. The owner, a grizzled man in his 70s named Pete Morrison, looked up from his inventory sheets when they walked in carrying the architectural plans. "Well, I'll be damned," Pete said when he saw the drawings. "Haven't seen those plans in 40 years. Where'd you boys find them? You know about these?" Marcus asked, hope rising in his voice. Pete adjusted his reading glasses and studied the plans more carefully. "Know about them? Hell, I sold half the materials for that build. Henry Thompson designed and built that cabin himself. Finest craftsman these mountains ever produced. Taught high school shop class down in Denver, but came up here every summer to work on his dream house." "What happened to the family?" James pressed. "The plans mention E and the children." Pete's expression grew thoughtful and slightly sad. "That's a longer story than you boys have time for today. But if you're planning to restore that place, you're going to need to understand what you're really taking on." 3 days into the restoration, Marcus made a discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about the cabin's history. He had been carefully removing rotted sections of the interior wall when his sledgehammer broke through into a hidden cavity between the logs. The space was deliberately constructed, sealed with careful craftsmanship that had kept its contents dry for decades. Inside the cavity, wrapped in multiple layers of oiled canvas, lay a leather-bound journal. The cover was worn smooth by handling, and the brass clasp still held secure despite the passage of time. Marcus called James over from where he was working on the foundation repairs, and together they carefully unwrapped their find. The journal's first entry was dated June 15, 1985, written in a woman's careful handwriting that spoke of education and thoughtfulness. The ink had faded to brown, but the words remained perfectly legible. "Today, I brought the children up to see their finished bedrooms," the first entry began. "Little Tommy can barely contain his excitement about having his own space in the loft, and Sarah keeps asking when we can move here permanently. Henry says maybe next summer, when his sabbatical comes through. I can hardly believe this beautiful place is really ours." James felt his breath catch. "Sarah," he repeated quietly. "That's Mom's name." Marcus was already turning pages, scanning the entries that chronicled a family's life in the mountains. The writer, who signed herself simply as E, described summer days filled with hiking, fishing, and the simple pleasures of mountain living. She wrote about teaching the children to identify wildflowers, about evening storms that drummed against the cabin's sturdy roof, about the peace she found watching sunrise paint the distant peaks. "Listen to this," Marcus said, reading from an entry dated July 4th. "The children have grown so much this summer. Sarah is becoming quite the little naturalist, collecting pressed flowers and drawing pictures of every bird she sees. She says she wants to live here forever, and some days I think she's the wisest of all of us." The entries painted a picture of an idyllic family retreat. But as James read further, he began to notice subtle changes in tone. References to Henry working longer hours, to financial pressures from the school district, to difficult decisions that lay ahead. The final entries, dated in late August, carried an undercurrent of sadness that made James's chest tighten. August 28th, he read aloud. Henry says we have to make a choice. The teaching position in Denver means stability for the children's education, but it also means leaving this place that has become the center of our world. Sarah cried when I told her we might not be back next summer. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that sometimes love isn't enough to keep you in the place where you're happiest? The final entry was brief and heartbreaking. September 2nd, we're closing the cabin today. Henry has hidden the deed and the important papers where the children won't accidentally find them. He says someday we'll be back when the circumstances are right. I'm leaving this journal as a record of the happiest summer of our lives. If anyone finds this years from now, know that this place was deeply loved. Marcus set the journal down carefully, his hands slightly unsteady. Do you think, he began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the possibility that was forming in his mind. The ages would be about right, James said quietly. If this Sarah was 8 in 1985, she'd be about Mom's age now. They sat in silence for several minutes, surrounded by the debris of their restoration work, each wrestling with the implications of what they had discovered. The coincidence seemed too remarkable to dismiss, yet too extraordinary to accept without more evidence. We need to ask her, Marcus said finally. Show her the journal, see how she reacts. What if we're wrong? James countered. What if it's just a coincidence and we're getting our hopes up for nothing? And what if we're right? Marcus replied, what if Mom spent her childhood summers here? What if this place isn't just some random cabin we stumbled across, but actually a part of her history that she's never talked about? The discovery cast their restoration work in an entirely different light. Every board they replaced, every section of roof they repaired, might be restoring not just a forgotten building, but their mother's childhood memories. The weight of that possibility made their efforts feel both more important and more daunting. That evening, when they called to update Sarah on their progress, James found himself listening to her voice differently, searching for any hint of recognition when they described their daily work. She asked detailed questions about the cabin's layout, about the view from the windows, about the stone fireplace they had uncovered beneath decades of debris. Her questions seemed too specific, too knowing, for someone who had never been there. Mom, James said carefully, we found something today, an old journal from a family that used to spend summers there. The silence on the other end of the line stretched just a heartbeat too long. A journal? Sarah asked, her voice carefully controlled. From 1985, a woman and her family. They loved that place very much. By the end of the second week, the brothers had fallen into a productive rhythm. Marcus arrived each morning with the sunrise, his truck loaded with materials, and the kind of determination that had built half the custom homes in Jefferson County. James usually followed an hour later, after reviewing the day's plans over coffee and making any necessary adjustments to their timeline. The cabin was slowly revealing its original beauty as they stripped away decades of neglect and decay. It was James who discovered the small rocking chair tucked away in the cabin's loft, hidden beneath a canvas tarp that had somehow survived the years better than the roof above it. The chair was a masterpiece of folk craftsmanship, clearly handmade, with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of deep love rather than commercial production. Every inch of the wood bore intricate carvings depicting mountain scenes, tiny deer drinking from a stream, eagles soaring above pine trees, wildflowers dancing in an invisible breeze. Marcus, come look at this, James called down from the loft ladder. The chair was sized for a child, perhaps 6 or 7 years old. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. With joints so perfectly fitted, they had held tight despite decades of temperature changes and moisture. Someone had spent months creating this piece, in carving each delicate detail with the patience of a true artisan. This had to be Henry Thompson's work, Marcus said, running his fingers along the smooth armrests. Look at these joints, these carvings. The same attention to detail we saw in the architectural plans. James found himself imagining a little girl sitting in this chair, perhaps reading stories or watching the mountains through the loft window. The image felt so vivid, so real, that it almost seemed like a memory rather than imagination. Do you think this was made for the Sarah mentioned in the journal? Before Marcus could answer, they heard a car door slam in the clearing below. They looked out to see their mother climbing slowly from James's sedan, which she had insisted on driving herself despite their protests. Sarah moved carefully, conserving her energy, but her eyes were bright with an anticipation they hadn't seen in weeks. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Marcus called down, hurrying down the ladder. "You should have waited for us to bring you up when we're finished." Sarah ignored his concern, her gaze fixed on the cabin with an intensity that made both brothers pause. She approached the building slowly, her fingers trailing along the newly repaired logs as if greeting an old friend. When she reached the heavy oak door with its weathered initials, she stopped completely. "The carvings are exactly as I remembered," she said softly, then caught herself. "As I imagined they would be," she corrected quickly. James and Marcus exchanged meaningful glances. Their mother's slip was too significant to ignore, but neither wanted to confront her directly. Instead, they watched as she explored the restored interior with the careful steps of someone navigating familiar territory in darkness. "The fireplace is in the wrong place," she said suddenly, then covered her confusion with a nervous laugh. "I mean, it's not where I would have expected it to be." "Actually," James said carefully, "we moved it back to where the original plans showed it should be. Someone had modified it at some point, probably in the 70s. Sarah's face went very still. She approached the stone hearth they had painstakingly rebuilt according to Henry Thompson's specifications, running her hands along the mantelpiece as if checking for imperfections only she could detect. "The stone came from the creek bed about a mile downstream," she said absently. "Henry spent weeks finding pieces that fit together just right. The silence that followed was deafening." Sarah seemed to realize what she had revealed, her face flushing with the embarrassment of someone caught in an unintended confession. Marcus and James stood frozen, afraid that any movement might shatter this moment of truth. "Mom," James said gently, "how do you know Henry Thompson's name?" "We never mentioned it to you." Sarah sank onto the old wooden crate they had been using as a makeshift bench, her composure finally cracking. For several moments, she simply stared at the restored fireplace, tears gathering in her eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of 40 years of carefully guarded memories. "Because Henry Thompson was my father," she whispered. "And this cabin was my home every summer until I was 18 years old." The confession hung in the air between them like smoke from the fireplace that had warmed countless family evenings decades ago. Marcus felt his knees go weak as the implications crashed over him. They weren't just restoring a random cabin for their dying mother. They were rebuilding her childhood home, the place where she had learned to love the mountains, where she had spent the happiest summers of her youth. "The journal," James said, his voice barely audible. "E stands for Elizabeth." "Your middle name," Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the emotions that were finally breaking free after years of careful containment. Above them, hidden in the loft, the small rocking chair waited patiently for its secrets to be fully revealed. The revelation that Sarah was Henry Thompson's daughter transformed everything about the restoration project. But it also raised new questions that gnawed at both brothers as they worked. Why had she never mentioned her mountain childhood? What had driven the family away from this place they so clearly loved? And why had she seemed so reluctant to share the truth until confronted with undeniable evidence? Sarah had left that afternoon with promises to return soon and tell them the full story. But 3 days had passed without the promised explanation. The brothers threw themselves into their work with renewed intensity, as if completing the restoration might somehow unlock the remaining mysteries of their family's hidden past. It was Marcus who made the next significant discovery. While reinforcing the cabin's back wall, where moisture damage had weakened the foundation, his shovel struck something hard, buried beneath years of accumulated soil and debris. After 20 minutes of careful digging, he unearthed a mason jar with a metal lid that had somehow maintained its seal despite decades underground. Inside the jar, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at his touch, lay a simple gold wedding band. The ring was unadorned, except for an inscription on the inner band that read, H&E Forever 1960. Beneath the ring, also wrapped in tissue, was a folded piece of paper with a message written in the same careful handwriting they recognized from the journal. Until we meet again. All my love, E. James studied the ring in the afternoon sunlight, turning it slowly in his palm. This has to be Mum's mother's wedding ring. Her grandmother, Elizabeth. But why would she bury it? Marcus asked. And why here behind the cabin? They had never known their maternal grandparents. Sarah had always told them that her parents died when she was young, before she met their father. The few family photos she possessed showed a much younger Sarah with an older couple, but she rarely spoke about her childhood or the circumstances that had left her essentially orphaned in her early 20s. The discovery of the ring prompted them to drive into Cedar Falls that evening, hoping Pete Morrison might provide more details about the Thompson family history. They found the hardware store owner locking up for the night, but he agreed to sit with them on the store's front porch when they explained what they had found. Elizabeth Thompson was a fine woman, Pete said, accepting the ring carefully and examining the inscription. School teacher, like her husband. They came up here in the late 50s, built that cabin as their retirement dream. Henry was handy with tools, but Elizabeth was the one with the vision. She's the one who designed the garden, planned the interior layout, made that place feel like a real home. What happened to them? James pressed. Our mother never talks about her childhood. Pete was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with how much he should reveal. There was an accident, he said finally. Winter of 1985. Henry was driving down the mountain during a bad storm, trying to get Elizabeth to the hospital in Denver. She'd been having chest pains. They hit black ice on Dead Man's Curve. The brothers felt the weight of understanding settle between them. The journal entries they had read made perfect sense now. The final summer of 1985 hadn't just been the end of childhood vacations. It had been the last time their mother saw her parents alive. Sarah was away at college when it happened, Pete continued. By the time she made it back for the funeral, she had to deal with settling the estate, selling the house in Denver, trying to figure out what to do with the cabin. She was just a kid herself, maybe 21, suddenly responsible for everything. Marcus thought about his mother at that age, facing such devastating loss alone. She never came back to the cabin after that. Not that I know of, Pete replied. I always figured it was too painful. Some places hold too many memories to revisit. The cabin just sat there year after year, waiting for someone to care about it again. The pieces of their mother's silence were beginning to form a complete picture. Sarah hadn't hidden her mountain childhood out of shame or indifference. She had buried those memories because they were too precious and too painful to examine. The cabin represented not just her happiest times, but also the life that had been cut short by tragedy and circumstance as they drove back toward Denver that evening. Both brothers understood that they were doing more than restoring a building. They were giving their mother a chance to reclaim a part of herself that she had lost 40 years ago. The ring in James's pocket seemed to pulse with the weight of all those buried years, all that unexpressed grief, all the love that had been locked away with memories too difficult to face. The next morning, they would return to their work with new purpose. They weren't just racing against Sarah's declining health anymore. They were racing against decades of unfinished grief, trying to create a space where healing could finally begin. James had always been methodical in his research, a trait that served him well in architectural work, but sometimes drove his more impulsive brother to distraction. While Marcus focused on the physical restoration, James found himself drawn deeper into the paper trail of the cabin's history. He spent his lunch breaks at the Cedar Falls County office, poring over property records, tax documents, and any other official paperwork that might shed light on the Thompson family story. It was during one of these research sessions that the clerk, a helpful woman named Dorothy, who had worked in the office for 30 years, mentioned that the Thompson property files contained some personal documents that had been stored with the deed when the estate was settled. "Sometimes families leave important papers with us for safekeeping," she explained. "Birth certificates, marriage licenses, things like that. Would you like me to check?" The manila envelope she brought out was thick with documents spanning several decades. Most were routine property tax records and maintenance receipts, but near the bottom of the stack, James found a birth certificate that made his hands tremble as he read it. Sarah Elizabeth Thompson, born July 15, 1957, in Cedar Falls, Colorado. Mother, Elizabeth Marie Thompson. Father, Henry James Thompson. The name Sarah Elizabeth Thompson seemed to leap off the page. Not Sarah Elizabeth Miller, their mother's maiden name that they had always known, but Thompson, the same last name as the cabin's builder, the same last name that appeared on all the property documents he had been studying. James stared at the certificate for several minutes, his mind struggling to process the implications. Their mother hadn't just spent childhood summers at the Thompson cabin. She had been born Sarah Thompson. Miller must have been the name she took when she married their father, but Thompson was her birth name, her true family name. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The journal entries signed E weren't written by some stranger whose life happened to parallel their mother's story. They were written by their grandmother Elizabeth about their mother Sarah, documenting summers that were part of their own family history. The little girl who had pressed wildflowers and drawn pictures of birds, who had cried when told they might not return the next summer, was their mother. He called Marcus immediately, his voice shaking as he explained what he had discovered. "We need to talk to Mom tonight," he said. "All of it, Marcus. We need to understand all of it." That evening, they sat in Sarah's living room with the birth certificate, the journal, the wedding ring, and the architectural plans spread on her coffee table like evidence in a trial. Sarah looked at each item with the expression of someone confronting ghosts she had spent 40 years trying to forget. "You want to know why I never told you about the cabin?" she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "It's because I couldn't bear to remember what I lost. Not just the place, but the life I was supposed to have there." She picked up the journal, running her fingers over her mother's handwriting. "Mom wrote in this every evening after dinner. She used to read entries to me sometimes, telling me that someday I would want to remember these summers when I was grown up with children of my own." "What happened after the accident?" Marcus asked gently. "Everything fell apart," Sarah replied simply. "I was a senior in college, engaged to your father, trying to figure out how to become an adult. Suddenly I was responsible for settling an estate, selling the house in Denver, deciding what to do with a mountain cabin I couldn't afford to maintain and couldn't bear to visit." She set the journal aside and picked up her mother's wedding ring. "I buried this the last day I came up here. It was spring of 1986, and I was getting married in 2 months. I thought if I left a piece of her here, maybe she'd still be part of this place somehow." James understood now why his mother had never spoken of her childhood. The cabin represented everything she had lost. Her parents, her innocence, the future she had planned before tragedy reshaped her life. Coming back here wasn't just emotionally difficult. It was like stepping into a life that had been interrupted 40 years ago. "But you kept the maiden name Miller," Marcus observed. "We always thought that was your family name." Sarah smiled sadly. "Miller was the name of the family who took me in after the accident. Good people who helped me finish college and plan my wedding. I legally changed my name to Miller because I thought it would be easier than explaining the complicated truth. So Thompson is our real family name," James said quietly. "Thompson is our real family name," Sarah confirmed. "And that cabin is our real family home." The truth about their family history gave new urgency to the restoration project, but it also brought devastating news. 2 days after Sarah's emotional confession, Dr. Reynolds called with results from her latest scans. The cancer had spread more aggressively than expected. 6 months had become 6 weeks, maybe less. Marcus threw himself into the work with the desperation of a man trying to outrun time itself. He arrived at the cabin before dawn and worked until darkness forced him to stop, pushing his 50-year-old body beyond its limits. James tried to maintain their methodical approach, but even he found himself cutting corners, choosing speed over perfection in ways that would have horrified him on any other project. It was during one of these marathon work sessions that James discovered the family portrait, tucked away in what had once been a bedroom closet. The silver frame was tarnished black, but the glass had somehow survived decades of neglect without cracking. Behind it, a black and white photograph showed a much younger Henry and Elizabeth Thompson standing in front of the completed cabin with a girl of perhaps 10 years old between them. The little girl in the photograph was unmistakably their mother. She wore a simple summer dress and had her hair in braids, but her smile was the same one that had greeted them every morning of their childhood. More striking still was the backdrop, the cabin, exactly as they were rebuilding it, with the stone fireplace visible through the front window and the carved door displaying its intricate details. "Look at this," James called to Marcus, who was replacing rotten porch boards with timber they had milled themselves. "This is what the cabin looked like when it was finished. This is what we're trying to recreate." Marcus climbed down from the porch and studied the photograph carefully. Despite 40 years of abandonment and their weeks of restoration work, they had managed to bring the cabin remarkably close to its original condition. The new logs they had installed matched the weathered originals. The rebuilt roof followed the exact specifications from Henry's plans, and even the stone foundation looked almost identical to the one in the photograph. "We're actually doing it," Marcus said, wonder creeping into his voice. "We're bringing this place back." But even as they celebrated their progress, both brothers knew they were racing against an opponent they couldn't defeat. Sarah's condition was deteriorating rapidly. She tired more easily during her visits to the cabin, needed help walking across the uneven ground, and had begun experiencing the kind of pain that no amount of medication could completely control. The local community had begun to take notice of their efforts. Word spread through Cedar Falls about the Thompson cabin restoration, and people who had known Henry and Elizabeth began stopping by to offer help. Pete Morrison brought lumber at cost and refused payment. A local electrician donated his services to run new wiring. A woman who had been Elizabeth's student 40 years ago spent an entire weekend helping them clean and organize the interior. "Your grandmother would be so proud," she told James as they worked together to restore the kitchen cabinets. "She always said this place would bring the family back together someday." The outpouring of community support was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. These people had loved Henry and Elizabeth Thompson, had watched young Sarah grow up during those summer visits, and had mourned when the family disappeared after the accident. Their willingness to help restore the cabin felt like a form of collective healing, an attempt to right a wrong that had persisted for too long. But time was running out. Sarah's latest visit had been brief and exhausting. She had managed to walk through the nearly completed interior, running her hands along surfaces that now looked exactly as they had in her childhood memories. The emotion of seeing her family home restored had overwhelmed her, and she had spent several minutes crying quietly in the bedroom that had once been hers. "I want to spend my last weeks here," she had whispered to her sons. "If you can finish it in time, I want to come home." The request galvanized everyone working on the project. The local volunteers began showing up earlier and staying later. Marcus started sleeping at the cabin rather than driving back to Denver each night. James took leave from his architectural firm to focus entirely on the restoration. They were so close to completion they could taste it. The roof was solid, the walls were chinked and weatherproofed, the fireplace drew perfectly, and the interior was taking shape exactly as Henry Thompson had envisioned it 60 years ago. But Sarah's strength was fading faster than they could work. The photograph of the completed cabin became their roadmap and their inspiration. Every detail had to match, every element had to be perfect. They weren't just restoring a building anymore. They were resurrecting a piece of their mother's soul, giving her the chance to come full circle in the place where her story had begun. The final week of restoration work blurred together in a haze of exhaustion, determination, and mounting anxiety. Sarah's condition had taken another turn for the worse, and Dr. Reynolds had quietly suggested to the brothers that they should prepare for the possibility that she might not have the strength for many more trips to the mountains. The unspoken message was clear. If Sarah was going to see the completed cabin, it had to be soon. Marcus had been working on the fireplace mantel when he noticed that one of the stones in the hearth was slightly loose. His attempt to secure it revealed a small cavity behind the firebox, deliberately constructed to serve as a hiding place. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather that had protected them from moisture and heat, lay a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The letters were love letters, written in 2 different hands. The first set, in feminine script they recognized as their grandmother Elizabeth's writing, were addressed to "My dearest Robert." The second set, written in a bold masculine hand, were signed "All my love, Bob," and addressed to "My beautiful Elizabeth." James felt his world tilt as he read the signatures. "Bob," he said aloud, his voice strange in his own ears. "Robert." Dad's name was Robert. They had always known their father as Bob Thompson. But seeing his name written in these intimate letters 40 years ago created a connection that neither brother had imagined possible. The earliest letters were dated 1981, when their parents would have been in their early 20s. "My beautiful Elizabeth," one letter began. "I can't stop thinking about our weekend at your family's cabin. The way the morning light came through the windows, the sound of the creek below the porch, the peace I felt watching you read by the fireplace. I've never experienced anything like the serenity of that place, or the joy of sharing it with you." Another letter, this one from Elizabeth to Bob, described their growing relationship in terms that made both brothers understand how deeply their parents had loved each other. "You fit into my family's world so naturally," she wrote. "Daddy says you have good hands and a builder's eye. Mother thinks you're the most polite young man she's ever met. But I love you because you see the magic in this place the same way I do." The correspondence revealed that their parents' courtship had centered around the mountain cabin. Bob had spent several summers there as Elizabeth's guest, learning woodworking from Henry, helping with maintenance projects, and gradually becoming part of the Thompson family tradition. The letters painted a picture of young love, nurtured in the mountains, of a relationship that had grown stronger with each shared sunrise and evening by the fire. "Look at this one," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's from Dad, dated August 1985. Listen, I know this summer has been difficult, with all the talk about your parents having to sell the cabin for financial reasons. But I want you to know that wherever we end up building our life together, we'll create the same kind of peace and love that your family has shared in these mountains." The letter was prophetic in ways their father couldn't have known. Within months of writing it, Henry and Elizabeth would be gone. The cabin would be abandoned, and Bob and Elizabeth would begin their married life carrying the weight of enormous loss. But they had kept their promise to each other. The home they had built in Denver, where Marcus and James had grown up, had been filled with the same quiet love and mutual respect that these letters described. James found himself thinking about his parents' marriage with new understanding. The gentle way his father had always treated his mother, the pride he had taken in her achievements, the way he had supported her through difficult times without ever making her feel weak or dependent. Those qualities hadn't developed randomly. They had been nurtured during summers in this cabin, under the tutelage of Henry and Elizabeth Thompson, who had modeled what a loving partnership could look like. "They met here," Marcus said wonderfully. Mom brought Dad to the cabin, and this is where they fell in love. The discovery gave new meaning to Sarah's desperate desire to return to the cabin for her final weeks. This wasn't just the place where she had spent her childhood. It was the place where she had met the love of her life, where their family's story had truly begun. Bringing her back here wouldn't just be a return to her roots. It would be a return to the source of everything good that had followed. As they worked through the night to complete the final details, both brothers felt the presence of their parents' younger selves in every corner of the cabin. The love letters had revealed that this restoration was more than just a gift to their dying mother. It was a restoration of their entire family's history, a return to the place where love had first taken root and grown into the family they had become. The morning Sarah returned to the completed cabin dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of golden light that made the Colorado mountains look like they had been painted by angels. Marcus and James had worked through the night to finish the last details, installing the final window trim and sweeping away every trace of construction debris. The cabin stood exactly as it had in the family photograph, every board and stone restored to its original beauty. Sarah's arrival was carefully orchestrated. James had driven down to Denver the night before to bring her up in comfort, while Marcus made final preparations at the cabin. They had arranged for a wheelchair to help her navigate the uneven ground, though Sarah insisted on walking the final 50 yards to the front door under her own power. "I want to approach it the way I always did as a child," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but filled with determination. She moved slowly across the clearing, supported by her sons, but clearly drawing strength from some internal source that had little to do with her failing body. When she reached the front porch, she stopped and placed her hand on the carved oak door with its weathered initials, closing her eyes as if absorbing memories through her fingertips. Inside the cabin, Marcus had made one final discovery while installing new floorboards in the main bedroom. Hidden beneath the original planking, wrapped in multiple layers of oiled cloth, lay a handmade quilt that had somehow survived 4 decades in perfect condition. The quilt was a masterpiece of traditional craftsmanship, sewn in a pattern called wedding ring, with tiny, precise stitches that spoke of countless hours of patient work. The quilt was clearly Elizabeth's handiwork, created during the early years of her marriage to Henry. Each ring in the pattern was made from different fabrics, and James realized that many of the pieces came from family clothing, a section from one of Henry's work shirts, pieces from Elizabeth's summer dresses, even small patches that might have come from children's clothes. It was a family history sewn in fabric, a tangible record of love expressed through countless quiet evenings by the fireplace. When Sarah entered the bedroom and saw the quilt spread across the bed they had built from Henry's original plans, her composure finally broke completely. She sat heavily on the edge of the mattress, her hands shaking as she touched the familiar patterns her mother had created 50 years earlier. "She was working on this the summer she died," Sarah said through her tears. "I remember watching her in the evenings, quilting by lamplight after dinner. She said it was for my future home, for when I got married and had children of my own." Marcus felt his throat tighten as he understood the significance of what they had found. "She was making it for you." "She never got to finish it," Sarah continued, running her fingers along the intricate stitching. "There's still one ring left incomplete in the corner. She always said she would finish it when I brought my husband home to meet them properly." James knelt beside his mother, seeing the unfinished section she indicated. The final ring in the pattern had been carefully marked but never sewn, waiting for a completion that had been prevented by tragedy. "But you did bring Dad here," he said gently. "The love letters we found prove that." Sarah nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. "The last summer before the accident, I brought Bob here for 3 weeks in August. Mother was so happy to finally meet the man I was going to marry. She spent every evening working on this quilt, saying she wanted to have it finished for our wedding. The weight of interrupted plans and unfinished dreams filled the small bedroom. Elizabeth had died, believing she would complete the quilt for her daughter's wedding. never knowing that tragedy would scatter the family and leave her final gift of love waiting in darkness for 40 years. "She would have wanted you to have it," Marcus said. His voice rough with emotion. Sarah lay back on the bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin, as she had probably done countless times as a child. The afternoon light streaming through the windows they had restored illuminated her face, and for a moment both brothers could see the little girl she had once been, secure in her parents' love and certain that the future held nothing but promise. "Tell me about the rest of it," she said quietly. "Tell me about everything you found, everything you learned while you were bringing this place back to life." Over the next several hours, as the sun moved across the Colorado sky and painted the mountains in shifting shades of gold and purple, Marcus and James shared every detail of their discoveries. They showed her the architectural plans, the journal entries, the wedding ring, the love letters. They told her about Pete Morrison's memories and the community members who had volunteered their time and skills. With each revelation, Sarah's understanding of her family's story grew more complete. She wasn't just returning to her childhood home. She was returning to the center of a love story that had shaped multiple generations, a place where her parents had built their dreams and where she had learned what it meant to be part of something larger than herself. In the days that followed Sarah's return to the cabin, a remarkable transformation took place. The woman who had been steadily weakening in the sterile environment of hospitals and suburban houses seemed to draw strength from the mountain air and familiar surroundings. She moved through the restored rooms with growing confidence, her steps becoming surer as muscle memory guided her to light switches, cabinet handles, and window latches exactly where her childhood hands remembered them. On her third morning at the cabin, Sarah asked James to drive into Cedar Falls to buy her a new journal. Not just any notebook, but a leather-bound book similar to the one her mother had kept during those final summers. She wanted something substantial, something that would last beyond her own lifetime. "I have stories to tell," she explained simply. "Stories that should have been shared years ago." The journal she chose was bound in rich brown leather, with cream-colored pages and a ribbon bookmark. When James presented it to her that afternoon, she ran her hands over the cover with the same reverence she had shown her mother's quilt. Then she settled into the rocking chair that Marcus had brought down from the loft and began to write. Her first entry was dated simply October 15th, "Coming home," and it began with words that would have made her mother proud. "Today I return to the place where my story began and where it will end. My sons have given me the greatest gift imaginable by restoring not just this cabin, but the connection to my family that I thought was lost forever." Over the following days, Sarah filled page after page with memories that had been locked away for 40 years. She wrote about summer mornings when her father would wake her before dawn to watch the sunrise from the cabin's front porch. She described helping her mother tend the vegetable garden that had once flourished behind the cabin, learning to identify edible wild plants, and the quiet contentment of reading by the fireplace while rain drummed on the roof. But she also wrote about the more difficult memories that she had never shared with anyone. The fear she had felt as an 18-year-old facing college and independence. The guilt that had consumed her after her parents' death, wondering if she could have somehow prevented the tragedy. The loneliness of building a new life without the foundation of family that had always supported her. "I realize now that I cheated my sons out of their heritage," she wrote in one particularly honest entry. "I was so afraid of my own grief that I denied them the stories that connected them to this place, to the generations that came before. They should have known about their grandfather's craftsmanship, their grandmother's wisdom, the love that built this sanctuary in the mountains." The brothers took turns staying with their mother, creating a rotation that ensured she was never alone, while respecting her need for independence. During their time together, Sarah began sharing the stories she was documenting, filling in gaps in family history that they had never known existed. She told them about their grandfather's service in World War II, about their grandmother's work as a teacher in one-room schoolhouses, about the network of friends and neighbors who had made the mountain community feel like an extended family. As word spread through Cedar Falls that Sarah Thompson had returned to her family's cabin, visitors began arriving with their own memories to share. Former students of her mother's brought photographs and stories. Old friends of her father's stopped by with tales of fishing trips and building projects. The cabin became a gathering place for the mountain community's collective memory, a center where stories were shared and connections renewed. Each evening, Sarah would return to her journal, documenting not just her own memories, but the stories that visitors brought to her door. She was creating more than a personal memoir. She was compiling a record of a way of life that was rapidly disappearing from the Colorado mountains. "This journal will be my legacy," she told Marcus one evening as they watched the sun set over the peaks her father had loved. "When I'm gone, you'll have the stories that explain who we are and where we came from. That's worth more than any inheritance I could leave you." The grandfather clock had been silent for 5 years, its pendulum frozen since the day their father died. Marcus had brought it up from Sarah's house in Denver, thinking it belonged in the cabin where time seemed to move differently, where the rhythm of days was measured by sunrise and sunset rather than digital displays. But like so many things touched by grief, the clock had simply stopped working, its intricate mechanism defeated by something that had nothing to do with springs or gears. It was James who suggested they try to repair it, partly as a project to occupy their hands during the long mountain evenings, but mostly because the silence seemed wrong in a place that was coming back to life. Sarah watched from her rocking chair as her sons carefully dismantled the mechanism, cleaning each part with the patience their grandfather Henry had taught them through his meticulous restoration work. The clock had been a wedding gift to Henry and Elizabeth, purchased in 1959 from a clockmaker in Denver who had emigrated from Germany after the war. Its brass pendulum bore an inscription: "May your time together be measured in love, not minutes." For 30 years, it had marked the hours in the Thompson household, its steady tick providing a comforting rhythm that spoke of order and continuity. "Your father always said he would fix this someday," Sarah observed, as Marcus carefully oiled the escapement mechanism. He was good with his hands, but clocks were beyond his expertise. When they finally reassembled the mechanism and wound the weights, the clock resumed its ancient rhythm as if it had never been silent. The sound filled the cabin with a presence that seemed almost magical, as if time itself had returned to witness Sarah's homecoming. "Listen to that," Sarah said, closing her eyes and leaning back in her chair. "That's the sound of my childhood. Every night I fell asleep to that rhythm. Every morning I woke to its chiming. The restored clock became more than just a timepiece. It became a symbol of continuity restored, of family traditions that had survived separation and loss." Sarah began scheduling her days around its chimes, taking her medications at the quarter hour, writing in her journal when it struck 9 each morning, receiving visitors when it announced the afternoon hours. Extended family members began making pilgrimages to the cabin, cousins from across Colorado and distant relatives from other states who had heard about Sarah's return to the mountains. Each visitor brought their own memories of Henry and Elizabeth, their own stories of summer visits and family gatherings that had centered around this place. Sarah's nephew David, her brother's son, whom she hadn't seen in 15 years, drove up from Colorado Springs with his teenage daughter. The girl was fascinated by her great-aunt's stories and spent hours listening to family history she had never heard before. Sarah watched her great-niece explore the cabin with the same wonder she herself had felt as a child, understanding that the restoration had created something larger than just a place for her own final days. "This is what your grandfather intended," Sarah told Marcus and James one evening as the clock chimed 8. "He built this place to bring the family together across generations. For 40 years, it sat empty because I was too afraid to face my own memories. But you boys have given it back its purpose. The brothers understood that their mother was right. The cabin had always been meant to serve as the family's gathering place, the central point where stories were shared and connections maintained. By restoring it, they had done more than save a building. They had restored the heart of their family's identity. While cleaning out the cabin's small storage room, Marcus discovered a wooden cross tucked away behind a stack of old National Geographic magazines. The cross was simple in design, but extraordinary in craftsmanship, carved from a single piece of pine with such skill that the grain seemed to flow like water around its contours. Along the base, barely visible unless you knew where to look, were the initials HT and the year 1963. Sarah's face lit up with recognition when Marcus brought the cross to show her. "Grandpa Henry made that the summer after I was baptized," she said, reaching for it with trembling hands. "He spent weeks getting the proportions exactly right, sanding it smooth as silk. Mother hung it above my bed, and I used to trace the wood grain with my finger every night before I went to sleep." The cross represented a side of her family that Sarah had rarely discussed with her sons. The Thompsons had been quiet in their faith, the kind of people who lived their beliefs rather than proclaimed them. Henry had served as a deacon in the small Methodist church in Cedar Falls, and Elizabeth had taught Sunday school for children whose families lived too far from town to attend regularly. Faith was practical for them, Sarah explained as she turned the cross over in her hands. It wasn't about grand gestures or loud prayers. It was about treating people with kindness, about building things that would last, about being grateful for what you had instead of complaining about what you lacked. James found himself thinking about the values his grandparents had modeled, values that had been passed down through his mother, even though she had never explicitly connected them to their religious foundation. The work ethic that had driven him and Marcus to complete the cabin restoration, the sense of responsibility they felt toward family and community, the quiet satisfaction they found in creating something beautiful and lasting, all of these had their roots in the faith that Henry and Elizabeth had lived out in their daily lives. That evening, Sarah asked her sons to join her in a simple prayer of gratitude. It wasn't something they had done together since they were children, but the request felt natural in the setting of the restored cabin, surrounded by the evidence of their family's love and craftsmanship. "Dear Lord," Sarah began, her voice steady despite her physical weakness, "thank you for bringing us home to this place. Thank you for giving my sons the strength and skill to restore what was broken. Thank you for the time we have together in this place that holds so much love." Marcus and James found themselves adding their own quiet words of gratitude, not just for the successful completion of their project, but for the deeper understanding of their family that the restoration had provided. The cross in Sarah's hands seemed to anchor their prayer, connecting them not just to each other, but to the generations that had come before. Later that night, Sarah hung the cross on the wall above her bed, exactly where her mother had placed it 60 years earlier. The familiar weight of family tradition settled around her like a comfortable blanket, and for the first time in months she slept deeply and peacefully, surrounded by the presence of those who had loved her and the promise that love would continue even after she was gone. The cross became a focal point for the quiet moments of reflection that punctuated Sarah's days. Visitors often remarked on its simple beauty, and Sarah would share the story of her father's careful craftsmanship and the faith that had guided his hands. In a time when many people struggled to find meaning in suffering, Sarah's calm acceptance of her approaching death became a testament to the same practical faith that had sustained her family for generations. The toolbox appeared almost ordinary, sitting on the cabin's workbench, a battered wooden case with brass corners and a leather handle, worn smooth by decades of use. But when Marcus lifted the lid, he discovered a treasure trove of hand tools that told the story of 3 generations of craftsmen. Each tool was meticulously maintained, wrapped in oiled cloth, and arranged with the kind of precision that spoke of deep respect for both the implements and the work they accomplished. At the bottom of the box, Marcus found a set of wood chisels that took his breath away. The handles were worn to a perfect fit from countless hours in Henry Thompson's hands, and the steel blades still held edges sharp enough to shave paper. Wrapped with the chisels was a small note in Henry's careful handwriting, "For my grandsons." When they're old enough to understand that building something beautiful requires patience, precision, and love, James joined his brother in examining their inheritance, recognizing immediately that these were tools of exceptional quality, the kind of instruments that master craftsmen accumulated over lifetimes of dedicated work. There were planes that could shave curls of wood thin as tissue paper, measuring devices accurate to fractions of inches, and specialty tools for joints and details that modern builders rarely attempted. "He knew," Sarah said quietly from her chair near the fireplace. "Even when you boys were babies, Grandpa Henry would talk about teaching you his trade someday. He said good craftsmanship was the one thing a man could pass down that would never lose its value." The discovery of the tools crystallized something that had been forming in both brothers' minds throughout the restoration project. This cabin couldn't be allowed to fall into neglect again. More than that, it needed to serve its intended purpose as a gathering place for future generations of their family. "We need to make this permanent," Marcus said, running his fingers along a perfectly balanced hammer. "Set up a trust, establish maintenance funds, create a system so this place stays in the family." James was already sketching plans in his mind. "We could add a small workshop in the back, display some of Grandpa's tools, maybe offer woodworking classes for the family kids. Keep the traditions alive." Sarah smiled at her son's enthusiasm, understanding that they had grasped something essential about their heritage. The cabin had never been just a retreat from the world. It had been a place where skills were passed down, where children learned the satisfaction of creating something with their own hands, where the values of patience and precision were taught through example rather than lecture. Over the following days, Marcus and James began documenting their grandfather's tools. Researching their history and learning about the specific techniques each implement was designed to accomplish. They discovered that Henry had been not just a skilled craftsman, but an innovative one, modifying standard tools to achieve effects that mass production couldn't match. "This is how we honor him," James realized. "Not just by preserving what he built, but by continuing to build. By teaching our kids and their kids that there's something sacred about working with your hands, about taking raw materials and turning them into something useful and beautiful." The brothers made a pact that day, witnessed by their mother and sealed with the weight of family tradition. The cabin would remain a Thompson family gathering place for generations to come. Children would learn woodworking using their great-grandfather's tools. The stories that Sarah was documenting in her journal would be shared around the fireplace that Henry had built with such care. Marcus carefully rewrapped each tool in its protective cloth, but not before using Henry's favorite chisel to carve his own initials alongside his grandfather's on the workbench. James added his initials as well, and they both understood that someday their own children would continue the tradition. The toolbox represented more than just a collection of implements. It was a tangible connection to a way of life that valued skill, patience, and the deep satisfaction that came from building something that would outlast the builder. Sarah's energy was fading with the shortening days of late autumn, but her determination to pass down family traditions remained strong. It was during one of these precious final weeks that she asked James to help her retrieve something from the cabin's highest shelf. A collection of handwritten recipe cards that had belonged to her mother. The recipes were written on index cards, yellowed with age, some stained with decades-old spills that told stories of busy kitchen afternoons and family meals prepared with love. Elizabeth's careful handwriting detailed not just ingredients and measurements, but the small techniques that made the difference between ordinary food and the kind of cooking that created lasting memories. "Mother's cornbread," Sarah said, holding up a card covered in her mother's precise script. She made it every Sunday after church, served it warm with honey butter. The secret was using a cast-iron skillet that had been seasoned for 20 years and never, ever using sugar in the batter. The recipe cards represented more than just cooking instructions. They were a curriculum for nurturing, a guide to the kind of hospitality that had made the Thompson cabin a place where everyone felt welcome. There were recipes for hearty stews that could feed unexpected guests, for desserts that required patience and skill, for preserves that captured the essence of mountain summers in glass jars. "I want to teach you boys these recipes," Sarah said with gentle insistence. "Not because I think you'll become great cooks, but because food is how families stay connected. Someday you'll have children here, and they should taste the same cornbread their great-great-grandmother made, should know the satisfaction of making something from scratch." Over the following afternoons, Sarah guided her sons through the ritual of family cooking. Marcus, who had never shown much interest in the kitchen, found himself surprisingly adept at the precise measurements and timing that good baking required. James discovered that his architectural attention to detail translated well to the careful layering of flavors that his grandmother's recipes demanded. "The apple butter recipe was your great-grandmother's," Sarah explained as they stirred a pot of slowly cooking apples with cinnamon and cloves. "She brought it from her family in Pennsylvania when she married your grandfather. Every October, we'd spend a whole weekend making enough jars to last through winter." These cooking sessions became some of the most precious hours of Sarah's final weeks. Working side by side in the cabin's restored kitchen, she shared not just recipes, but the stories that gave them meaning. She told them about holiday meals that had brought the extended family together, about the way her mother had taught neighborhood children to bake bread during the Depression, about the comfort food could provide during times of sorrow and celebration alike. "Food is love made tangible," Sarah said one evening as they sat around the table, sharing a meal they had prepared together. "When you cook these recipes for your own family someday, you'll be giving them more than just nutrition. You'll be giving them connection to everyone who came before." James carefully copied each recipe into a new notebook, adding his mother's stories and memories alongside his grandmother's instructions. The collection would become another legacy, another way for future generations to understand the values and traditions that had shaped their family. As November deepened and Sarah's strength continued to ebb, the kitchen became a sanctuary where time moved slowly, and every meal felt like a celebration of continuity. The simple act of breaking bread together, using recipes passed down through generations, created a sense of communion that transcended the sadness of approaching loss. "Promise me," Sarah said one evening as they finished washing dishes from another family meal, "that you'll keep cooking together even after I'm gone. That you'll teach these recipes to your children and grandchildren. That you'll remember that the best gifts aren't bought in stores. They're made with your own hands and seasoned with love." The wildflower seeds came from Pete Morrison's hardware store, but the idea came from Sarah herself during one of her last strong days in early November. She had been sitting on the cabin's front porch, wrapped in her mother's quilt and watching the aspens lose their final golden leaves, when she asked Marcus to drive into town for a very specific purchase. "I want packets of mountain wildflowers," she said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised both her sons. "Columbines, Indian paintbrush, lupines, black-eyed Susans. All the flowers that used to grow wild around here when I was a child." The seed packets were small and ordinary-looking, each one containing hundreds of potential blooms that would sleep through the coming winter and emerge with the spring snowmelt. Sarah studied each packet carefully, reading the growing instructions and bloom times with the attention of someone, planning a garden she might never see. "These are for next spring," she explained to James and Marcus as they gathered around the kitchen table that evening, "and for all the springs that come after. When you boys bring your children here someday, I want them to see the mountains the way I remember them. carpeted with flowers that turned the meadows into paintings. The next morning, despite the early November chill and her obvious fatigue, Sarah insisted on participating in the planting. They worked together in the clearing around the cabin, Sarah directing while her sons scattered seeds according to her careful instructions. Columbines for the shaded areas near the tree line, paintbrush for the sunny slopes, lupines for the rocky soil behind the cabin. Mother always said that planting flowers was an act of faith, Sarah said as she watched Marcus work the columbine seeds into the earth near the front porch. You put something tiny and seemingly lifeless into the ground, trusting that nature knows what to do with it. James found himself deeply moved by the symbolism of what they were doing. These seeds would lie dormant through the harsh mountain winter, through the snows that would soon blanket the cabin and the clearing where they worked. But when spring returned, they would respond to warmth and moisture with an explosion of life and color that would transform the landscape. Every year, when these flowers bloom, we'll remember this day, Sarah said, leaning heavily on the porch railing, but smiling with genuine joy. We'll remember that beautiful things can grow from the smallest beginnings, that life finds a way to continue even in the most difficult circumstances. The seed packets themselves became treasured keepsakes after the planting was complete. Sarah tucked the empty envelopes into her journal, along with notes about where each variety had been planted and what they might expect to see when spring arrived. She drew simple maps showing the location of each flower bed, creating a guide for future maintenance and expansion. "This is my gift to the generations I'll never meet," she wrote in her journal that night. "Children who will run through meadows of columbines, young people who will pick bouquets of paintbrush for their sweethearts, families who will spread quilts among the lupines for summer picnics. I may not be here to see them bloom, but I'll be part of every flower that grows from these seeds." Marcus and James understood that their mother had created something more profound than just a flower garden. She had planted hope itself, had created a living reminder that love continues to bloom long after the planter has gone. Every spring for decades to come, the mountainside would burst into color as a testament to Sarah's faith in the future and her determination to leave beauty behind. That night, as the first snow of winter began to dust the mountain peaks, the brothers sat with their mother by the fireplace and talked about the miracle of seeds, about the patience required to plant something you might never see flourish, about the courage it took to invest in tomorrow when today felt uncertain and fragile. 3 years had passed since Sarah's peaceful death on a snowy December morning, and the cabin had become exactly what she had envisioned. A gathering place where family stories were shared and memories were kept alive. The wildflowers she had planted bloomed magnificently each spring, transforming the clearing into a riot of color that drew visitors from across the valley. But it was the sound that greeted every guest that most perfectly captured Sarah's enduring presence. The memorial wind chimes had been Marcus's idea, crafted during the long winter months following their mother's passing. He had used wood salvaged from the cabin's original construction, pieces of pine and oak that had weathered decades of mountain storms and still rang with clear, pure tones when the wind moved through them. Each chime was carefully tuned to create harmonious intervals, and together they produced music that seemed to capture the very essence of the mountains themselves. James had helped design the chime's suspension system, using principles of architecture and physics to ensure that even the gentlest breeze would create melody. They hung from the cabin's front porch, where Sarah had spent her final mornings watching the sunrise paint the distant peaks in shades of gold and rose. The chimes sang constantly, their music changing with the weather and seasons. Gentle summer breezes created soft, contemplative melodies that seemed perfect for reading or quiet conversation. Autumn winds produced more energetic rhythms that matched the changing colors of the aspens. Winter storms generated deep, resonant tones that spoke of power and permanence, while spring zephyrs brought light, dancing notes that celebrated renewal and growth. Visitors often commented on the chime's unusual beauty, and family members would share the story of their creation and meaning. Children who had never met their grandmother Sarah would sit on the porch steps, listening to the music and absorbing family stories that connected them to their heritage. The chimes became a focal point for reflection, a reminder that love creates echoes that persist long after the original voice has fallen silent. Marcus's own children, now teenagers, had grown up making annual pilgrimages to the cabin, learning woodworking skills with their great-grandfather's tools and cooking meals from their great-great-grandmother's recipes. They understood that the cabin represented more than just a family retreat. It was the physical embodiment of values and traditions that shaped their identity. James had finally married, and his young wife had embraced the cabin traditions with enthusiasm, learning to make apple butter and cornbread while listening to stories about the remarkable woman who had brought this place back to life through her son's love. The new generation of the family was already planning to add their own contributions to the cabin's legacy, ensuring that it would continue to serve as a gathering place for generations yet unborn. On quiet evenings, when the wind moved just right through the pines, the chimes would create melodies so hauntingly beautiful that family members would stop their conversations and listen in reverent silence. In those moments, Sarah's presence felt so real that her sons could almost see her rocking in her favorite chair, smiling at the sound of children's laughter and the gentle murmur of family voices sharing stories around the fireplace she had loved. The cabin stood as solid and welcoming as the day they had completed its restoration, a testament to the power of love expressed through service and sacrifice. The brothers had given their mother the gift of coming home, but in return, she had given them something far more valuable, an understanding of who they were, where they came from, and what it meant to be part of something larger than themselves. As the wind chimes sang their endless song of memory and hope, the Thompson cabin continued its patient vigil in the Colorado mountains, ready to welcome the next generation of family members who would find healing and connection in its weathered walls and time-honored traditions.